On a warm, sunny afternoon, in a quiet suburban neighborhood, a young boy, around 10 years old, was playing outside his home. He had been looking forward to this moment all day. His friends had gathered in the yard with him, and they were all excited to enjoy the afternoon together. The boy was tossing a football back and forth, laughing as he tried to catch it. It wasn't anything special, just a normal, carefree day, full of simple joys that every child should experience. The houses around him were well kept, with neatly trimmed lawns and flower beds blooming with colors. The sounds of birds chirping and children playing echoed down the block. The neighborhood was peaceful, with everyone minding their own business, going about their usual routines. For the boy and his friends, there was nothing to worry about. They were just enjoying their time, playing games and making memories, as kids do. As the laughter and playful banter continued, an unexpected sound broke through the air, the hum of a car engine getting louder. The boy didn't notice at first, still running around, trying to outpace his friends in a game of tag. But soon, the sound of the car pulling up in front of his house grew louder, and curiosity struck. The car came to a stop, and a black police vehicle with flashing lights parked across the street from the boy's yard. The boy paused and looked toward the vehicle. He didn't know what to think. His heart skipped a beat when he saw two white officers step out of the car, their uniforms crisp and their movements deliberate. It was unusual for officers to show up like this in their neighborhood, and the boy's gut told him something wasn't right. The officers approached with serious faces. Their eyes swept over the yard, scanning the surroundings. One officer called out to the boy, his voice loud and commanding. "What's going on here? Are you playing alone?" Confused, the boy looked up, trying to understand the question. "I'm just playing with my friends," he replied, his voice soft but clear. "We're having fun." The officers didn't seem convinced. They asked again, this time with a hint of suspicion in their tone. "What are you doing here? Who else is with you?" The boy tried to explain, but their questions kept coming, each one feeling more like an interrogation than a simple inquiry. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Why was this happening? Why were they asking so many questions about him playing in his own yard? His friends, noticing the officer's attention turning toward them, slowly backed away, unsure of what to do. The boy felt a surge of confusion and fear. He hadn't done anything wrong, so why were the officers acting like this? Despite his attempt to explain himself, the officers remained stern. They didn't seem to be listening to him. Their eyes narrowed as they continued to question him, their voices growing more serious. The boy's anxiety deepened. Why was this happening to him? What had he done wrong? He glanced nervously at his house, hoping someone would come outside and help him. But no one was there. The moment began to feel strange, almost unreal. The boy's innocent afternoon was quickly turning into something he couldn't understand. Something was wrong, but he didn't know what. What started as a fun game of football was now a situation that made him feel uneasy and small. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of an unexpected and life-changing encounter. The boy stood frozen in the middle of his yard, the football forgotten in his hands. The two officers stood before him, their eyes scanning him with a kind of suspicion that made his heart race faster. He tried to speak, but his words seemed to get lost in the air, swallowed by the tension hanging between them. The officer's presence, so serious and overwhelming, made him feel as though he was doing something wrong, even though all he had been doing was playing. "Are you sure you're not causing any trouble around here?" one of the officers asked, his tone sharp. The boy didn't understand. He was just a kid, playing in his own yard, enjoying a peaceful afternoon with his friends. But the officer's questions seemed to imply that something was wrong, something that the boy couldn't see. "I'm not causing any trouble," the boy replied, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm just playing football with my friends." But the officer didn't seem satisfied with that answer. Instead of nodding and letting the boy go back to his game, the officers exchanged a look between them. The boy felt a shiver run down his spine as they both continued to watch him. not moving. The silence stretched on, the seconds feeling like minutes. The neighborhood that had once felt so calm now seemed distant, as if the world around the boy was no longer the same. He noticed his friends standing farther away, watching from a safe distance. They looked just as confused and worried as he felt, but no one knew what to do. It was just him and the officers now, the only people in the yard. The officers began to ask more questions, their voices even more authoritative now. "Where are your parents?" the second officer asked, his tone no less serious. The boy was hesitant for a moment. His parents were not home. They were both at work. He didn't want to worry the officers, but he also didn't want them to think he was lying. "They're at work," the boy said softly, glancing at the house behind him. "Why are you alone out here then?" The first officer continued, his voice colder now, as if the boy's answer wasn't enough. The boy looked down at the ground, trying to figure out what they wanted to hear. He wasn't sure what he had done wrong, but the questions kept coming, and each one made him feel smaller. It felt like everything he said only made them more suspicious. "Are you sure there's nothing else going on?" the second officer asked, eyeing the boy carefully. "No one else is around." "I'm just playing," the boy repeated, but his voice sounded weaker now, as if the words no longer had the strength to convince anyone. He could feel his hands starting to sweat, his palms slick as he gripped the football tighter. The officers didn't seem to believe him. At this point, the boy was starting to lose hope. He didn't know how to make the officers understand that he wasn't doing anything wrong. All he wanted was to go back to his game, to feel the simple joy of tossing the ball with his friends, without the fear that something bad might happen. But just as he began to feel trapped in the heavy silence, something unexpected happened. The sound of a car engine broke the tension. The boy's heart lifted slightly as he turned to see a black SUV pull up in front of the house. He didn't know who it was, but he hoped this might be the person who could help. The car pulled up to the curb, and the boy's eyes immediately brightened. He hoped this was the moment someone would step in and explain what was happening. He couldn't stand the tension anymore, the confusion weighing down on him. The officer's stern questions and his own uncertainty had made everything feel more complicated than it needed to be. The vehicle stopped, and a man stepped out. The boy didn't recognize him at first, but there was something about his confident stride, the way he held himself, that caught his attention. The man was tall and well-dressed, wearing a suit that made him stand out in the quiet neighborhood. His face seemed calm, but there was an intensity in his eyes that suggested he knew exactly what was going on. The officers had paused for a moment, noticing the new arrival, but they didn't seem to recognize the man either. As the man approached, the boy could feel a wave of hope washing over him. Maybe this man could fix the situation. Maybe this would be the end of the questioning. The boy watched as the man approached the officers, his movements slow but deliberate. "What's going on here?" the man asked, his voice deep and steady. There was no hesitation in his tone, no uncertainty. It was the voice of someone who had dealt with situations like this before and knew how to take control. The officers looked at each other, clearly caught off guard. They didn't answer immediately, but the second officer spoke up, clearly unsure of how to respond. "We're just asking the boy some questions," the officer said, his voice not as firm as it had been before. The man's eyes flicked over to the boy, then back to the officers. "Why?" he asked simply. "What's the reason for all this?" The officers didn't seem prepared for that question. They mumbled something about a report, but their answers were vague, and it was clear they didn't know how to explain why they were detaining the boy for just playing outside. The man's posture shifted slightly, and the boy could see that the man was no longer standing just for himself, but for him. The officer's dismissive tone had become uncomfortable in the presence of this man. There was something about his authority that made the officers stand a little straighter, even though they hadn't yet fully understood who he was. "Let him go," the man said firmly, his voice unwavering. "He's not doing anything wrong." The officers exchanged a glance, clearly confused but not wanting to escalate things further. One of them reluctantly nodded, and the tension began to ease. As the man turned to face the boy, he gave him a reassuring smile. "It's all right, son. You're safe now." The boy felt a weight lift from his chest. The officers had finally backed off, and he was free to return to his game. But there was something else in the air now, something he couldn't quite place. The presence of this man was more than just an authority figure stepping in. It was the feeling of someone who cared about what had just happened and was willing to make sure the boy's rights were respected. As the boy began to breathe more easily, he realized he didn't recognize the man. But somehow, he knew this wasn't the end of the story. Something told him this encounter wasn't just a coincidence. And little did he know, it wasn't just his afternoon that had been changed, but his entire perspective on the world around him. The boy stood there for a moment, unsure of what had just happened. The officers had started to back off, their stern faces softening as the man who had just arrived seemed to have the situation under control. For the first time in what felt like forever, the boy's heart began to slow down, the knot in his stomach loosening. He hadn't been expecting this. This sudden change in the mood, this sudden shift in power. The man turned to the boy and smiled again. The same calm, reassuring smile that had made him feel, for the first time in a while, that everything might be okay. "You're all right now," the man said softly. His voice was warm, yet there was a certain authority to it that made the boy feel safe. The way he spoke, it was clear that the man was used to handling situations like this with ease. But the boy still felt a lingering sense of confusion. Why had the officers treated him like that? Why had they questioned him so intensely without any real reason? And why had this man stepped in, so unexpectedly, to help? There were too many questions swirling in his head, and for a moment, he didn't know whether to ask or just stay quiet. Before he could say anything, the man turned back to the officers. "You do realize who you've been questioning, don't you?" he asked, his tone still calm, but now carrying a layer of sharpness. The officers exchanged uncertain glances, their confidence shaken by the man's words. They were still standing near the boy, but the tension in their posture was evident. It was as though they were beginning to realize that they had made a serious mistake. They hadn't just stopped a random kid from playing. They had stopped someone who was connected to something far more important. The boy's confusion deepened as the man continued, speaking to the officers without even looking at them. "This is my son," the man said, his voice clear and firm. "You've just questioned my child in front of me, without any proper reason. Do you understand what that means?" The officers were quiet now, their earlier confidence completely gone. They looked at each other, unsure of what to do next. The man's words had knocked the wind out of their sails, and they didn't know how to respond. They had no idea who he was until just moments before. But now, they were standing in front of someone with power, someone whose influence was far greater than theirs. They were out of their depth. The boy watched the scene unfold, still trying to process everything. His father had just stepped in, and suddenly, the whole situation felt different. He felt like he had been invisible, caught in something he didn't fully understand. But now, with his father speaking up, everything seemed clearer. The officers had been acting like he was in trouble, like he had done something wrong. But it was all based on assumptions, not facts. The man turned back to the boy, his gaze softening again. "You're safe, son," he said, his tone now full of warmth and care. "No one's going to bother you anymore. You don't have to worry." The boy nodded, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. But as the officers began to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an ordinary encounter. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a simple mistake. His father's words carried a weight that suggested something much bigger was at play. He knew that the moment he would remember forever wasn't just the day he played football in the yard. It was the day he learned that sometimes people are judged for who they are, not just what they've done. The boy stood there, watching as the officers slowly got back into their car, their earlier confidence now replaced with a quiet hesitation. The man who had stepped in to help him, his father, was still standing tall, his arms crossed, his face calm but serious. The officers didn't speak anymore, their heads lowered, clearly feeling the weight of the mistake they had made. Without another word, they drove off, the sound of their car fading as it turned the corner and disappeared from view. The boy's heart was still pounding in his chest, but now it was mixed with confusion and a sense of wonder. What had just happened? Why had his father come to his rescue like that? The whole situation felt unreal, like something out of a dream. His father turned to him with a gentle smile, but the boy could see that his eyes were still serious. He didn't look angry, but there was something about his expression that made the boy think that this wasn't just about one bad moment. This was bigger. The man knelt down to the boy's level, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're okay," he said softly. "You didn't do anything wrong." The boy nodded, grateful for his father's presence, but still unsure about everything that had just unfolded. "Why did they treat me like that?" the boy finally asked, his voice small and uncertain. "I was just playing. Why did they think I was doing something wrong?" His father's face softened as he sighed. "Son, sometimes people look at others and make assumptions based on how they look. It's not fair, but it happens. It doesn't mean you did anything wrong. You're just a kid, having fun in your own yard." The boy thought about this for a moment. He had always heard his father talk about things like fairness and equality, but this was the first time he was experiencing it firsthand. It was confusing, and it didn't seem right. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had just been playing with his friends, enjoying a normal day. Why had the officers thought they needed to question him? His father stood up, looking down the street where the officers had disappeared. He seemed lost in thought for a moment, his eyes narrowing. Then he looked back at the boy. "You know, there's something you should understand. This isn't just about today. This kind of thing happens far too often. People, especially people like us, sometimes get treated differently. People might look at you and think they know who you are, just based on how you look. But you're more than that, son." The boy felt a lump form in his throat. He didn't fully understand what his father meant, but he could feel the seriousness in his voice. It was like his father was trying to explain something important, something that the boy would need to know as he grew older. "Don't ever let anyone make you feel small or less than who you are," his father continued. "You're just as good as anyone else. You have the right to be treated fairly, to play in your yard without anyone questioning you. And if someone tries to tell you otherwise, you stand tall, and you don't let them get away with it." The boy nodded, feeling both reassured and a little sad. He didn't want to believe that people would treat him differently just because of how he looked. But his father's words made him realize that the world wasn't always as simple and fair as it seemed. As they walked back to the house together, the boy felt a mix of emotions: relief that the ordeal was over, sadness at the injustice, and a new understanding that things weren't always as easy as they seemed. His father had taught him something today, something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. And though the boy couldn't fully understand everything yet, he knew one thing for sure. His father had just shown him what it meant to stand up for what's right, even when the world around him tried to tell him otherwise. As they made their way back into the house, the boy's mind was still racing. The events of the afternoon felt like a whirlwind. Everything had happened so quickly. And yet, it felt like his world had shifted. His father had stepped in, taking control of the situation, and the officers had backed down. But what now? What would happen next? Was it over? The boy's father closed the front door behind them and led him into the living room, where they sat down together on the couch. The boy couldn't help but stare at his father, his mind trying to process everything he had just learned. "Dad," he said quietly, "what were the officers thinking? Why did they stop me like that?" His father let out a deep breath, his face thoughtful. He hadn't answered that question fully before, and the boy could tell that it was something important, something his father needed to explain in a way that would make sense to him. "Son," his father began slowly, "it's not about you. It's about them. People sometimes make assumptions based on how someone looks. They see a kid playing outside. They see someone who's different from what they expect, and they start thinking something is wrong. That's how things go sometimes. The boy listened carefully, his eyes wide as he tried to absorb his father's words. "But I didn't do anything wrong," he said softly. "I was just playing, just like any other kid." "I know," his father said, his voice filled with understanding. "But sometimes people don't see it that way. They don't always treat everyone the same." He paused for a moment, looking out the window, his thoughts distant. And that's where things get complicated. The boy's head was spinning. He couldn't quite wrap his mind around it. How could something so simple, just playing in the yard, turn into a big problem? It wasn't right, and it didn't seem fair. His friends hadn't been questioned, so why was he? Why did it feel like he was being treated differently? His father seemed to sense his confusion and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's not easy to understand now, but one day you'll see what I mean. People may treat you differently because of things you can't control. Your skin, your background, your name. It's not always fair, but that doesn't mean you have to accept it." The boy thought about that for a long time. He looked out the window at the street, at the houses lined up neatly on either side. It all seemed so normal, so peaceful, but now it felt like something was off. Like the world wasn't as simple as it had once seemed. "But what can I do?" the boy asked, his voice full of uncertainty. "How can I make them see that I'm just a kid, like everyone else?" His father smiled gently, the lines on his face softening as he looked at him. "You don't have to make them see anything right away. What you can do is stand tall, be proud of who you are, and never let anyone make you feel small. The world might be unfair sometimes, but you don't have to let that stop you from being you." The boy nodded slowly, trying to absorb what his father had said. He felt a strange sense of peace now, but also a determination growing inside him. He wasn't going to let this moment define him, but he also wasn't going to forget it. The world wasn't always going to be fair, but maybe, just maybe, he could make a difference in his own way. As they sat there together, the boy knew that things had changed. Not just for him, but for his father too. The officers had questioned him because of who he was, but his father had stood up for him, showing him what it meant to take control of the situation, to fight for what's right. The boy didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing for sure. His father had taught him something invaluable today, something that would stay with him forever. Later that evening, after dinner, the boy sat quietly at the kitchen table, his mind still turning over everything that had happened that afternoon. His father had always been a source of strength for him, but today he had seen a different side. It wasn't just about being a parent. It was about standing up for what was right, even when the world around them seemed determined to make things difficult. His father had always taught him to be proud of who he was, to treat everyone with respect, no matter their background or appearance. But today, the boy had learned something deeper. Sometimes, standing up for yourself meant more than just doing the right thing. It meant challenging the assumptions others made about you, especially when they weren't based on reality. As he sat there, lost in thought, his father came over and sat beside him, as if sensing that his son had questions left unanswered. The boy looked up, and his father smiled softly. "You've been thinking a lot, haven't you?" The boy nodded, his mind still swirling. "Yeah. I just don't get it, Dad. Why do people treat others differently just because of how they look? I didn't do anything wrong." His father's smile faded a little, and he took a deep breath. "It's a tough question. The truth is, sometimes people make judgments about others based on things they don't even understand. It's not fair, and it's not right. But it happens every day. People see someone who looks different or comes from a different place, and they assume things about them. And that's where the problem starts." The boy's brow furrowed as he tried to make sense of it all. But how do we change it? How do we stop it from happening? His father thought for a moment, looking out the window at the setting sun. The quiet of the evening seemed to give him time to reflect. "We start by teaching others, by showing them what's right. And sometimes we have to speak up, even when it's uncomfortable. It's not easy, and it won't happen overnight. But change comes when people refuse to stay silent when they see something wrong. The boy absorbed his father's words, feeling a mixture of determination and uncertainty. He wanted to believe that things could be different, that people could change, but he knew it would take more than just wishing for things to get better. It would take effort, and sometimes a lot of courage. But today, he had seen his father stand up for him, and that gave him hope. "Do you think people can change?" the boy asked, his voice quiet but full of curiosity. His father smiled again, a hint of pride in his eyes. "I believe people can change, son. It starts with understanding each other, seeing each other for who we really are, not just what we look like or where we come from. It takes time, and it takes hard work. But it starts with you. You can make a difference by being kind, by treating others with respect, and by never letting anyone make you feel less than who you are." The boy nodded slowly, the weight of his father's words settling in. It was a big responsibility, but it felt like something he could do. He could start with himself, by being the kind of person who didn't judge others based on appearances, and by standing up when he saw something unfair happening. As the evening grew darker and the sounds of the neighborhood settled into a quiet hum, the boy felt a sense of calm come over him. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let the world tell him who he was. And maybe, just maybe, if he stood up for what was right, he could inspire others to do the same. He smiled to himself, feeling the strength of his father's words fill him up. He had learned something important today, something he would carry with him forever. And as the night drew to a close, he knew that this was just the beginning of a long journey, one where he would fight for what's right, one step at a time. The next morning, the boy woke up with a quiet sense of purpose. The events of the previous day had been overwhelming, but they had also sparked something inside him. He couldn't quite put it into words, but something had changed. He had seen the world differently, through the eyes of his father, and it had made him realize how much power he had within himself to shape the world around him. After breakfast, the boy went outside to play. But this time, things felt different. He was no longer just a kid running around in his yard. He was more aware of the world around him and the people who lived in it. His friends were still playing, laughing, and enjoying the morning, but the boy knew that there was something he needed to do. He couldn't just go back to life as usual after everything he had learned. He stood at the edge of the yard, watching his friends, when one of them, a boy named James, called out to him. "Hey, you coming or what?" James asked, tossing the football in the air and catching it effortlessly. The boy smiled and waved, but before he could join the game, he found himself thinking about what his father had said the night before. "Change starts with you," his father had told him. The boy thought about that for a moment. Change didn't always have to come from grand gestures or big speeches. Sometimes it started with small actions, with the way he treated others, with the way he saw the world. The boy took a deep breath and walked toward James. "Hey, James," he called out as he approached. "Can we talk for a second?" James looked a little surprised, but nodded. "Sure, what's up?" The boy hesitated and said, "I've been thinking about something. You know, how people sometimes treat others differently because of how they look or where they come from." James blinked, unsure of where this conversation was headed. "Yeah, I guess. But that doesn't really happen around here, does it?" The boy thought for a moment, considering how to explain it. "It happens more than you think," he said. "Maybe not here, but in other places. People see someone who's different, and they treat them like they're not as important." James frowned, clearly not understanding fully, but he listened. "So what can we do about it?" The boy smiled. "We can start by being kind to everyone, no matter where they come from or what they look like. We can make sure everyone feels welcome, not just the people we know or the people who look like us." James nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, I guess I get it now. That sounds like a good idea." The boy felt a warmth spread through him. He wasn't sure if he had made a huge impact with his words, but for the first time, he felt like he was making a small step toward the change he wanted to see. It wasn't just about big, dramatic actions. Sometimes it was about starting with small conversations, small moments of understanding. As they played together, the boy couldn't shake the feeling that things were beginning to shift. Maybe the world wasn't perfect, and maybe there would always be people who made assumptions based on appearances. But he had learned that standing up for what's right didn't always require shouting or fighting. It started with conversations, with actions, with making sure everyone felt seen and heard. Later that day, as he walked back into the house, his father was sitting in the living room, reading the newspaper. The boy walked over to him, feeling a sense of gratitude for everything he had learned. "Hey, Dad," he said, sitting down beside him. "I talked to James today. I think he gets it now." His father looked at him with pride. "I'm proud of you, son," he said, his voice full of warmth. "You're starting to understand something very important. It's not always easy, but it's worth it. And the more people who understand, the better the world will be." The boy smiled, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. He didn't have all the answers yet, and he knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. But he was starting to understand what it meant to make a difference, one small action at a time. As the day came to a close, the boy sat quietly in his room, looking out the window at the neighborhood he had always known. Everything seemed the same, but he knew he had changed. He had learned that sometimes making a difference didn't mean changing the whole world all at once. It meant starting with the people around you, with the way you treated others, and with the conversations that helped people see the world through a different lens. And that, the boy realized, was how change really began. It was small at first, but with every step, every conversation, every act of kindness, it would grow into something greater. And that gave him hope for the future.